So my own work sort of spans from fairly technical writing, fairly medical writing, to sort of the edges of journalism, more public information officer type work. But I also have a lot of connections in the journalism community. And these guidelines that I'm going to present from the University of Cambridge really are very broadly applicable, I think. They sort of span technical communications, medical communications, and then also they're very relevant to how the media has been communicating, and also people like how politicians have been communicating evidence, which they've been doing a little bit more of lately. So, one thing that I wanted to make sure to say was that this is a huge topic. I mean, it just explodes. It can be there's so many questions and so many areas where it's impactful. And I'm trying to contain it to a relatively short talk by just focusing on the 5 rules that these folks present and just introducing the concepts. I'm going to give a few tips about how they recommend applying them, but I'm not going to delve into really the applications. That's probably more than enough for a whole nother talk. So let's get started. Really, the pandemic has been one of the most recent and probably biggest examples of how important it is for science and medicine to be able to communicate clearly to the general public. But it's just sort of the most recent example. This sort of divide between research and everyone else has been this gap that it has been difficult to bridge, and people have been working on different strategies for doing that for decades at least. And so other examples have been vaccines. I think it sounds like the coronavirus vaccines actually may go a little bit smoother, but vaccines have been an issue for decades, and there have been controversies and people just really questioning the evidence and coming up with misinformation, and it's a long story. Another example is climate change. That was another one that the evidence has been there for decades, and because of how it's been communicated, that has influenced how much it's been addressed. There are other factors, of course, but it's another issue where there's been a lot of controversy, to say the least. So evidence shows up in science, medicine, health, society, and a lot of other areas. And as far as the strategies to try and bridge that divide and make evidence easier to understand, interpret, for people to be able to understand what it means for them, I think some of the past strategies, and one of the points that the authors of this paper really make is that in the past, scientists and certainly the media have been about a flashy story, about trying to simplify science and medicine, which are usually quite complex. And the authors suggest that maybe that may not really be the right strategy, and that some of their research shows that perceived attempt to persuade people actually erodes trust. And so they have 5 points to try and propose a different strategy. And so, as I said, this came out in Nature. The article is titled 5 Rules for Evidence Communication. It's from the Winton Centre for Risk and Evidence Communication, and that's at the University of Cambridge. So for the structure of my talk, I'll say a little bit more about who their target audience is, who they're trying to reach. I'll say a little bit more about them at the Winton Centre. That's one of the keys of trustworthy communications, is also being quite open about who is communicating and why. I'll say very briefly a little bit about their methods. I'll go through the 5 rules, and I'll end with some take-home messages and some of my own thoughts for going forward. So the Winton Centre itself, the majority of their work has been working with the medical fields. So I think the first area where evidence has been, well, maybe actually it's hard to prioritize these, but one of the most relevant is healthcare professionals, of course, media, news, scientists and researchers. One that you might not think of all that often, but legal professionals. So evidence, of course, comes up in court cases, in courtrooms. And as we've seen a lot of lately, that we also see evidence, at least I think some of the good examples of leadership these days have been using evidence to explain policies and explain public health measures. The types of evidence, sort of following on that note, for example, in medicine, the potential harms and benefits, side effects, also efficacy is a very important piece of evidence to share. Efficacy also of preventative measures. You could think of masks or social distancing, but also, in health, there's so many preventative strategies that do show real benefit, and there is evidence, there's strong evidence behind them. Pretty much all scientific results and findings. Moving a little bit away from research, also evidence in policies, so education policies, health, also civic life examples. And as I mentioned earlier, evidence for legal cases. So the field of evidence communication is not all that new. I think it's been around for a few decades. The Winton Centre, though, it was founded in 2016, and its funding is from benevolent organizations, and it really is quite clear about its message. It would like to, or they would like to present evidence in a transparent way to inform but not persuade. And another part of their mission is to help people understand what is known. And this is a point that I'll make throughout the talk. It's a very important point to understand what's not known, so that people can make up their own minds based on the evidence. And that might actually be a little bit idealistic or optimistic, but I think it is a good approach. It's at least good to consider and worth a try. So a little bit more about the people at the Winton Centre, or at least in the Risk and Evidence Communication group. They're a fairly diverse group of people. Several of them are journalists or otherwise reporters, either broadcast news. One of them has worked with the BBC for close to 20 years, I think. They also are experts in data interpretation, and they have research leaders in the fields of behavior and health research and psychology, and specifically also they interact with a lab about social decision making, or that focuses on social decision making. As far as their methodology, really they're almost entirely, they're doing surveys. But they do have quite impressive reach. They have done a number of international surveys reaching Asia and Europe and the United States, and a number of different, I'm not sure how global their reach is, but at least they do make quite a bit of an effort to have international surveys. And the focus, or at least the recent focus of theirs, has been specifically communicating uncertainty, and also understanding how audiences decide what evidence to trust and how narratives affect decision-making. So now, getting to the 5 rules. The first one I've already mentioned, it's part of their mission, is to inform but not persuade. The second one is to offer balance but not false balance. The third is to disclose uncertainties. The fourth is to state evidence quality. And the fifth is the one that I think is the newest for me, and I think also potentially the most challenging, is to inoculate against misinformation. And I'll go through each of these to explain a little bit more and to, when possible, give a few general tips about how they suggest you might be able to apply them. So why would you want to inform and not persuade? You probably noticed that marketing was definitely not on the list as far as their target audience. And there are certainly cases where you probably do want to persuade. Their take is that, at least when it comes to the audiences that I described earlier, maybe persuasion shouldn't be the #1 priority. That really showing that you trust your audience to be able to understand what you're telling them, and to be able to, to yourself try and make it as clear as possible what the evidence is that you're trying to communicate to them. That is probably or potentially a better relationship between communicators and their audiences. So their research has shown that people who are perceived as really trying to persuade their audiences can be viewed as less trustworthy. And they've also found that trust depends on expertise, honesty, and good intentions. And again, also, I mentioned some politics, but this hasn't always held true in the political realm. But back to more scientific findings. So one of their recent surveys was from 13 countries, and they pulled out a few quotes that sort of fit in with what the observations that I just listed. And so people were saying things like, the news, the media is untrustworthy. Their aim is to sell news, not to sell the truth. And sort of people have more confidence in friends and family because they believe that family members have no reason to lie. At the same time, they seem to be able to forget that maybe family members don't have that much expertise. There are also, questions about conflicts of interest and motivations, and so people wondering, who really funds the WHO, believing that that could be China, and a point that comes up very often, or no, a point that comes up at least relatively often, is with medications. Are companies being fully transparent about side effects? And their recommendation for putting #1, for putting this into practice, is really all about transparency, being open and honest, and showing good intentions. So being very clear about your motivations, sort of why you performed a study to begin with, why you were asking the question, and why you want to communicate the results to an audience. And part of that also is, being open if there are any conflicts of interest. I mean, if it's in your interest to sell someone a drug, you're maybe not the most trustworthy authority. People are also, and this will come up a couple more times in my talk, audiences are becoming a little bit more savvy about how evidence is collected. And so also being clear about the methods that are used can help you gain trust. And this one, the last one, fits in with uncertainties, and it will come up again and again that it's really important to talk about the limitations, caveats, and uncertainties in whatever it is that you're presenting and communicating. Now, the second one, offering balance but not false balance. So the example that comes to my mind most readily is how climate change was communicated in the US. And I don't know the specifics of whether it was actually a mandate, but so the coverage there was the news organizations felt that they had to give equal coverage to all of the viewpoints. So it didn't matter if you had a 95% consensus on one view and a 5%, well, maybe not a consensus if it's 5%, but 5% of researchers having a different view, that those would get equal airing time. So audiences would see still 50-50, which of course sort of skews what they're seeing and what they're hearing about. At the same time, so that's what, don't give equal coverage to everything. But at the same time, do be transparent that there are 5% of there's 5% of the community that has a different view, or there's 5% of the evidence that suggests something else. Or if there's more, certainly if there's a larger percentage of the evidence that suggests, or if it's not consistent, it's really important to say that. And one reason to do that, so to begin with, it's good to be transparent. Another reason is that if you don't mention something, audiences will probably find it, or someone will find it, and it will be used as evidence that you were hiding something, which is going to not do you any favors when it comes to trust. It's also an opportunity for misinformation. And then, yes, sort of back to the climate example, to try and keep it proportionate to the quantity of evidence and also the quality of evidence. And that's one of the other points, which is coming up soon. As far as how to offer balance, to begin with, I'm not sure how much this is a scientific term, but don't cherry pick your findings. Again, don't just talk about the results that fit with your hypothesis. This is something that, this is sort of a separate but related issue in the scientific field and medicine, is that researchers, and they have been held accountable for this, but there's a tendency to, in that pursuit of the flashy story, to just use the results that fit sort of a hypothesis or a theory that you're trying to advance. So they absolutely, that's not the right path. That's not the right path for a number of reasons. As far as getting back to just presenting all of the evidence fairly, they strongly recommend visual aids. So there's so many different varieties of charts, and they make it so much easier to just quickly see. So when you're talking about a treatment and the pros and cons, a simple table of pros and cons can help people absorb information very quickly. Also, something that helps people see, if there's a rare occurrence in 3% of cases, something like a pie chart helps make that clear. Bar charts also. So just really, visual aids are really helpful. The third one is about disclosing uncertainties. And this is, so really, trust is hard to earn, but it's very easy to lose. And I think even the group at the Winton Centre fell into this trap a little bit themselves, and certainly lots of people fell into this trap during the pandemic, and that is saying something like it was certain when it wasn't. And so the Winton Centre's research really suggests that it's far better to be open about things that you don't know. The people will be more understanding of that than if you act certain and then it turns out you're wrong. And then it will be very hard for you to earn their respect again. And they strongly advocate being open about what you don't know. And this is another thing that I think both science and medicine have been trying to communicate better, not necessarily evidence, but about the scientific process, that science and medicine, that we're always learning more, we're always acquiring more evidence. And oftentimes, it's fair to make the best use of the evidence you have available, but to recognize that the evidence you have might be limited. And so, yes, at least when science is working the way it should, it's about always learning more and always reassessing what you thought you knew. So yes, their recommendation, and I think there have been some examples even in politics where people have been upfront about saying when they don't know, saying that they're trying to figure it out, and saying how they're trying to figure something out, and as much as possible trying to give timelines of when you think you might be able to figure it out. They also suggest that the degree of uncertainty is something important to convey as well. And without going into p-values and standard deviations, that it's fair to say, we've observed a range from X to Z or X to Y, and that also helps, because very few things in science and medicine are absolutely certain. And I think it would benefit everyone to make it clear that that's just, these things, there's always some uncertainty, and it's better to be open about it. And another piece of evidence that they've been finding is that you might wonder whether, if you're saying, well, science sometimes, well, basically it's always, not always changing, but you're always getting more evidence and you're always figuring it out, and there's so much that you don't know, that might actually cause people to not trust you. But their findings suggest that doesn't seem to be how it's been viewed, at least in the surveys that they've done so far. The fourth one is about stating evidence quality. So there's a lot going on in this. I guess it's sort of a poster, and I don't expect you to be able to read it. We can send it out afterwards if people are interested. This actually came from a chemical sort of community, but a lot of the points here are very similar to, or I've already discussed, and are very closely related to the types of points that the authors are trying to highlight. And one of the things, so this is also a good example of audiences are being trained and interested in training themselves and interested in just knowing how to spot bad science. And so there are about a dozen examples here. Some of the ones I've already talked about are, yes, if you see a headline that just seems like it's sensationalized, it's worth trying to figure out whether it might just be a little bit overblown. Conflicts of interest are, of course, important. Correlation and causation has been something that has probably been a bit of a bane in science communications, and I think people are getting better, but there can be still a tendency to think that just because things happen at the same time, they might be linked, which is not always the case. Selective reporting, so like the cherry picking, and problems with sample size. So this was something in their surveys, they found that audiences were really paying attention to clinical trial size. There was an example of a trial that was maybe 100, maybe less people, and the people in their surveys were pointing out that that's not enough. That's a relatively small trial, and that the evidence or the findings from that weren't very trustworthy given the trial size. People are also starting to ask about where evidence comes from, how it's collected, and again, that one that shows up again and again is caveats, limitations, and uncertainties. And the last one, so inoculating against misinformation. I started talking about a little bit earlier, and it's fair to wonder, if you're talking about, science is uncertain, medicine is uncertain, there ranges of what the results say, and that it would be fair to at least wonder whether that might also cause audiences to lose a little bit of trust or doubt what you're telling them, or that it might actually help fuel misinformation or conspiracies. And from their research, they found that maybe not, that doesn't seem to be the case when they've looked at it, but they do have a way to combat it preemptively, and that's to think about or sort of foresee ways that the data could be misinterpreted or that it could help fuel misinformation, and to address that straight out. And they call this pre-bunking, so sort of preemptive debunking. As far as how to do that, and this is why I think it's quite hard. To begin with, it requires quite a bit of foresight. It also requires really knowing your audience, so that you can anticipate where they might misunderstand and where maybe disinformation might pop up. They suggest that you can do this by, so if you're talking about medical research, looking into patient forums, looking into social media to see really what these communities are discussing amongst themselves. And that will give you a better sense of, their concerns and their thoughts and, what really matters to them. Now, in summary, really, there isn't going to be, this is an approach that I would say these are fairly general rules, and that, there isn't going to be one size that fits all. This really needs to be tailored to the audience you're trying to reach, or the message that you're trying to convey, the evidence that you have to convey. And there is a continuum. There are probably, not including marketing, but I suppose marketing is an example of where you are trying to persuade. But on the continuum, probably some persuasion does fit in some cases, and so it comes down to a judgment call of what's the best approach for the certain situation that you find yourself in. And these really are just, I think, alternative approaches, sort of a different way of thinking about how you're talking about evidence and research. And while I wouldn't take them all, I'm jumping ahead of myself. I don't consider them rules. I consider them useful considerations. I do think they're right, but I'm not sure how universally applicable they can be. But I think it is very fair to at least reconsider this notion of selling the science. I actually, from the work that I do in press releases and sort of news, I think it's something that I try to really combat is overselling things. That it is better to be straightforward about what the data actually say. And they also talk, depending on who the communicators are, trying to change people's beliefs might also not be the right approach. So yes, I think these are useful. They're good food for thought. I don't consider them rules. Also, a very important caveat to their work is that there's actually limited evidence, and they're open about this. There's limited evidence about how to communicate evidence better. It's sort of a difficult thing to measure, and obviously their entire center that has been created to try and understand this better. But as I pointed out, they're relatively new. And so this is something that is still, in some ways, just getting started. And so these particular rules, there isn't a lot of, there aren't a lot of clear examples of how they've been put into practice, and certainly not in the context of trying to measure the impact of those strategies. But that said, after I read this, I did start noticing, started paying attention to, I think I see it a little bit more in news. I also have seen it, I think, a little bit more in public health campaigns. And also I've seen that there is this shift in popular science education. So streaming and YouTube and television shows are, I think, I've seen more examples of shows that are trying to be very clear that science is complicated and that what drives it is actually what's unknown. It's about questions and uncertainties and trying to know more. And I think that's very good. I think that's very encouraging. So in short, I think these may be useful to you. They may, to varying degrees. I also have just found it interesting to see how other communicators have been using it on me as an audience. And so yes, I think it's an interesting new approach, maybe not that new, but an interesting way of revisiting evidence communication. So I think with that, thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions.